Welcome to Day 16 of Western Civilization. Our focus today is going to be the 100 Years' War between England and France. The notable locations today, that is going to be Orleans, France. Notable dates will be 1337 through 1453. This is the span of the 100 Years' War, and yes, it is longer than 100 years. Historians kind of give it that term. 1431, that is the death of Joan of Arc, and 1453 is when France is unified. These will all make sense at the conclusion of today's video. Now, in the wake of the bubonic plague, a lot of European populations were depleted. And we talked about yesterday that had a lot of societal and economic implications. But what we see in Europe is that Europe is experiencing the emergence of a lot of strong regional states instead of a strong centralized empire because it is so fragmented. So therefore, by the 15th century or the 1400s, we have very powerful kingdoms that have emerged. Italy, Spain, France, England, Russia, so on and so forth. And we've looked at this in our previous unit. We talked about the empires and expansion. Now, these laid the foundation for powerful monarchies, kind of what we refer to as absolutism. And the sources of their income, large part were taxes. They had large standing armies. Some were mercenary forces, which are paid forces. And so you have these empires or kingdoms that have basically the desire to expand outward and gain more wealth and more resources and the support and means to do so. Now, we're going to talk about what happens between two kingdoms that share a sphere of influence and have tension when they butt up next to one another. So the historical context of the 100 Years' War, in 1328, French King Charles IV died without an heir to the throne. Again, you're going to see this is very common throughout history. So in England, his grandson was Edward III. He was a 13-year-old king. Edward's mom, Isabella, wanted her son to be the king of both kingdoms, of England and France. Now the French nobility did not want an Englishman or a boy as a king, so what they did is they chose the king's cousin, Philip. So England, more so influenced by Isabella, was outraged by this, and so England declared war on France. Now prior to the war, France was not a united country for the 100 Years' War. The French king only controlled about half of the country. And if you take a look at this map right here, feel free to pause this at any time, but France today goes far more east than what you see here. And the land that the actual French king owned, or the French monarchy, would be everything in orange here. English possessions are going to be in green, okay? And there's other vassal or other noble holdings throughout this region. Now let's take a look at France before and after the war. Again, once you listen to this, feel free to pause it and really kind of examine the differences between France before and after. So again, in this map now, English holdings are going to be in purple, and you can see they have a small hold here on the French coast. And between or during the 100 Years' War, you see a further expansion by the English in this region of the world. And so now compare that with this map over here between 1430 and 1453. Eventually, when France will become unified, you will see that a lot of this territory here is lost by the English. So again, territory kind of goes back and forth during this, but eventually the important thing to note is by 1453, pretty much all of this will be French, or what we consider to be French. Now the war itself, France was far richer, it was more populous, they had a larger army, about 50,000 soldiers or so, and their population hovered around about 16 million. Where the English were a little bit different. The English were the underdogs. For the most part, they were geographically isolated because they're not attached to the European continent. Their weapon technology was helpful. They had huge innovations. They engaged in quick and profitable raids. They weren't involved in, or they didn't desire to get tied down for a long period of time. Steal what you can and destroy all else. And one of their tactics was to capture the enemy and hold ransom. Now, historically, the war had been fought between knights, and a lot of this spawned from the Crusades that we looked at in the last unit. However, during this Hundred Years' War, you're going to see a lot of different strategy in terms of battle tactics. You see more or less people that are nobles or commoners that kind of come into this fighting, and so with that, there isn't a lot of people that are well versed in the art of weaponry and fighting, and so they have to rely on new technologies to really have an advantage. And one of the things that the English do is they introduce this new weapon called the longbow. And so they're able to attack French soldiers at a further distance. And this was devastating for the French. And this is one of the reasons why the English had so much success early on. During the 116 years of the Hundred Years' War, they had 68 years of peace and really only 44 years of fighting. But because the Hundred Years' War, or what we refer to as the Hundred Years' War, it basically had three different segments. And so across those three different segments, that's when we have this fighting. But we typically give it this term because it's when it starts, eventually, and when it ends. Now, one thing that's kind of a negative during the Hundred Years' War as well is that the nobility is killed. Therefore, a lot of the rivals to the kings, or kind of their checks and balances, are going to cause the kings to inherit much more power and influence in the region. All right, just getting back really quick to the longbow technology. The longbow had more penetrating power than a crossbow. It could pierce the armor of a knight at about 200 yards, that's about 2 football fields, and it allowed for a lot more rapid fire, about 6 arrows in a minute or so. One interesting story, if you take a look at this image right here, the English archers were so feared that the French, when they would catch them, they would cut off their 2 fingers. And so what would happen is those that weren't caught, they would hold up these 2 fingers, and it would be the ultimate sign of disrespect for the French. And so it's the equivalent of holding up the middle finger in our culture today. So what is the influence or the impact of the war? You have patriotism that was born. So now during this war, people are identifying themselves as Englishmen or Frenchmen rather than families or clans or stuff like that. And this is something that's going to really move throughout the rest of the European subcontinent as eventually states and countries become a little more centralized and organized. And eventually this will be kind of one of those things that is going to lead to World War I with this concept or notion of nationalism. Now, to gain support and money for the war, propaganda was also spread in church pulpits, where each side kind of trumpeted their perspective. And so the governments took advantage of this, all right? They raised taxes, and therefore they had more money to develop more technologies and a stronger fighting force. Okay, King Henry V renewed his family's claim to the French throne. He was able to lead a decisive battle at Agincourt in 1415, and he was able to gain control over Normandy, Paris, and the majority of the northern portion of France. Okay, this comes from an artist's depiction of Joan of Arc at the coronation of Charles VII in a cathedral. We'll talk about her in just a moment. But this is kind of getting into the legitimacy of the French king over the English declaration of their right to that land or that territory. Okay, so the French eventually go back and claim that lost land that was conquered by the English that I mentioned just previously. So again, you take a look, anything in green is going to be English holdings and the French right here. Alright, so in 1429, there's this mysterious young peasant girl named Joan of Arc, and she thought that she saw visions and that was compelled by God to lead the French against the English. So what's interesting is she dressed like a man, first of all, She saw these visions that were supposedly divinely inspired by God. And what the French did is they gave her an army for hearing voices and dressing like a man. However, Joan of Arc is extremely successful at leading the reconquest of French lands from the English. Now, eventually, Joan was captured during an attack on Paris. She was burned as a heretic because of her unnatural dress and her divine guidance. And even though she was captured, the French still were able to advance. So by 1450, the English lost the majority of their centers in the European mainland. And by 1453, the French captured the last English fortress, and that marks kind of the unification of France. That concludes our brief survey overview about the Hundred Years' War. Tomorrow we're going to look at what happens within Europe with the Reformation, and we'll see how that impacts the religious nature of what's going on with a lot of the European citizens.